Labą dieną, sveiki visi susirinkę prie žydrųjų ekranų. Ir mano vardas yra Eglė Kačkutė. Aš dirbu Vilniaus universiteto filologijos fakultete prancūzų filologijos katedroje. Ir šiandien man yra labai malonu jūs visus pakviesti į pirmą Vilniaus universiteto lyčių tyrimų seminarų ciklo seminarą, kurį rengia du Vilniaus universiteto padaliniai iš tiesų ir dvi tyrimų grupės. Tai yra feministinės politikos ir socialinės kritikos tyrimų grupė TSPMI ir filologijos fakulteto tyrimų grupė apmąstant motinystę. Ir šitas seminarų ciklas buvo sugalvotas todėl, kad mes kažkaip pagalvojom, kad iš tiesų šiuo metu visuomenėje ir Lietuvoje vyksta labai daug svarbių diskusijų lyčių klausimais. Ir yra tokio daug, tai yra labai normali visuomenės diskusija. Ir mes pagalvojom, kad kaip mokslininkės ir mokslininkai dirbantis šitoj srity, kad ko gero mes irgi turim tam tikrą kaip ir uždavinį prisidėti prie šitų diskusijų visuomeniai, tiesiog skleisdami savo tyrimus, aiškindami, ne tai kad aiškindami, bet tiesiog skleisdami savo tyrimus, todėl kad ir Vilniaus universitete yra daroma tikrai aukšto lygio atliekama lyčių studijų tyrimų, tik tai apie juos ne visada žino nei visuomenė, nei ko gero ir pati Vilniaus universiteto bendruomenė. Tai mes tikimės, kad šiuo tikslu mes kažkaip ir užpildysime tokį tam tikrą vakuumą. O šiandien man yra labai malonu, aš perduodu žodį TSPMI podoktorantūros stažuotojai Jelenai Šalai, kuri pristatys šios dienos prelegentę projekto, kuriam aš vadovauju, Madden narę, daktarę Anne O'Brien. Tai labai ačiū ir geros paskaitos visiems.
Ačiū, Eglė. Thank you, Eglė. Hi, Anne. And hi to everyone who decided to join us this evening. It's already 5 p.m. in Lithuania, so thank you for joining us. And today we have Dr. Anne O'Brien as a guest, and she's going to present the lecture on women, inequality, and media work. And we really hope that the lecture will be interesting both to those studying or working in academia, but also to those working in media industry, and or probably just those who are interested in diversity and inclusion in society more generally. My name is Jelena Šalai, and as Eglė mentioned, I'm postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of International Relations and Political Sciences at Vilnius University with an interest in feminist studies, and I'll be moderating today's discussion, today's lecture. A bit of technical information for you. So just Anne's lecture will take about 40 minutes. And after that, we will have 20 to 30 minutes to your questions and your discussion. And you are really welcome to just feel comfortable and free to ask them and participate in the discussion. And we are streaming on 2 channels simultaneously. So we are here in Zoom. And for those of you who are watching and listening in Zoom, you can ask your questions in chat or just wait after the lecture, just raise your hand and ask your questions in voice. And also for those listening to us on Facebook, you can ask your questions in comment section, and I will pass them to Anne afterward. So it's really a great pleasure for me to present today's speaker. Dr. Anne O'Brien is an associate professor in the Department of Media Studies at Maynooth University, Ireland, and she has published a number of articles on the representation of women in radio and television, on women workers in creative industries, and examining why women leave careers in screen production, which seems to be a very important question. She has written about how media produce content on mental ill health, suicide, intimate partner homicide, and domestic violence. And Anne has also undertaken research on community media, examining its social benefit and governance need in funded project for the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. It seems that recent years were very productive to you, and because in 2019 you've published your own book of Women, Inequality and Media Work, and as you know, your today's talk will be based on this book. And also with your colleagues, Susan Lee, you co-edited selection on media work, mothers and motherhood, and you yourself just recently completed a book on graduate experiences of media work. And currently Anne is researching the experience of mothers who are workers in creative industries. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems to be a very impressive biography. But I just wanted to add that Anne is really a very warm and approachable person, so don't be scary, and you're very welcome to participate in discussion afterward. And she is also interested in Lithuanian context and about the film industry here. So just join us after that. And just to let you know Anne O'Brien better, we had a small chat yesterday with Anne, and I decided to start with a small informal question, if we can, that has a personal story behind it, and that's the story. So first time when I met Anne in person, it was exactly 3 years before. It was also January, as I remember, and we've been in Stockholm, participating in workshop together with other researchers who do research on women's position in creative industry. And I was there together with my colleague paskaita, and there were also researchers from UK, Ireland, Sweden, and Australia. It was pre-COVID times. Yeah. And what I remember about Anne is really a small thing, but when she was presenting herself, she said that she's doing research on behalf of the population. It seems to be like very, simple and a bit ironic saying that, oh, that's really nothing, I'm doing nothing special, just exploring topics that are relevant for 50% of population at least. So just could I ask you, Anne, to comment a bit on how did you start your career in academia, because I know that previously you've been working in TV production, and just how did you get interested in topics that are related to gender equality?
Yeah, so I started working in television production, and I was really interested in documentary making, and was lucky enough to get to do that for quite a period of time, for maybe 10, 15 years. And I was also lucky insofar as the company I worked for was located right next door to the university. And in the early 2000s, the university decided they would like a media degree. They approached the company I worked for. And so I had this really interesting pathway into academia, into teaching, into designing programs, and then also into doing research. And one of the things I was very curious about was, as I kind of hit my 30s, I noticed that a lot of the women I had been working with kind of for the previous 10 years just kind of started to disappear. And I was wondering what was going on with that. They really weren't available for work anymore, or I just wasn't crossing paths with them as much as I would have. And I was curious. I think that was probably the first research question I asked was, obviously some of these women were going away to have children. And there was kind of a presumption that they were leaving industry because they really wanted to go home and look after children. But I was curious as to whether they really wanted to actively do that and spend their time at home looking after children only, or was there something else going on? And that was the first paper I published in 2014, looked at the fact that women get kind of pushed out of the industry because it's very, very difficult for them to stay in media production. And I'll get into some of the detail of that in the talk. And also they got pulled out by having to do a lot of the care work at home. And just between the push and the pull, sometimes there was just a tipping point where the women decided, look, it's just easier if I do one or the other. And the one was always care work. So that was kind of my first foray into looking at women and how they experience media work in ways that are quite unequal to men. And I love the fact that you've remembered, Yelena, the comment about, I only study half of the world's population. I think sometimes we can be really apologetic about doing gender and doing feminism and doing women's stuff, but actually we're half the world's population. Why would we not research that? So if you want me to, I can start into...
Yeah, absolutely. The floor is yours.
Okay, let's get going on that then. So this is the title of the book, Women, Inequality and Media Work. And I often experience this in life where events kind of catch up with what's going on in my head. So as I've said, I was kind of working on gender inequality in media from 2014 and wrote kind of a series of papers looking at why do women leave media work? How is media work gendered? In what ways are they excluded? And eventually I got to the point of thinking, okay, I need to write a whole book about this. And I got the book contract in 2017, right as the stories about Weinstein broke. Harvey Weinstein, big scandal in the States. That year, Time magazine awarded Person of the Year to the Silence Breakers, who were the women that broke silence about Weinstein and the abuse they had suffered under him. One of those women was Laura Madden, who you see there in the picture, and she's actually Irish, which I didn't know when I was writing the book, and I only met her subsequently. But actually, Laura was the very first woman to go on the record against Weinstein and to take a court case with him. Ashley Judd, because she's a big Hollywood actress, got a lot of the kind of recognition around that. But actually, it was Laura who first said, yeah, I'll go on the record, you can quote me, this is what happened. Weinstein had attacked her in a hotel room in Dublin during a meeting with him there when she was quite young and her career was just starting. And I think it's always struck me, I mean, Laura's a really fabulous person and lovely to meet and really warm and really interesting. And I think, okay, great, we had the silence breakers. We also had the silence of missing out on what Laura might have had to say on film. We never got to see the films that she would have made. And I think that is really, really important to kind of know just what we've missed out on. So this was the book that then came out 2 years subsequently in 2019. And it was around the time that Weinstein was being sentenced. I mean, I think we were all kind of surprised that he got prosecuted and got sentenced for what he did. And I think there was a little concern at that time that everybody would think, okay, well, their sexual harassment is fixed. Now all the problems are dealt with. We can move on. Women are now equal in media industries. And I think if the book does any kind of piece of work, it's to show that, yes, absolutely, sexual harassment is a problem, but there are a lot of other problems as well. And I'd just like to talk to you about some of those. So the book was based basically on interviews I did with 60 women. And the women worked in all kinds of areas of both film and television. Some of them were very kind of high-end directors. They were all kind of Irish in the sense that they were either working out of Ireland or they were working internationally, but identified as Irish. And so I talked to everybody from a broadcast coordinator or a runner on a set to very high-end Oscar-nominated directors. So it runs a very broad swathe of what I think of as kind of film and TV industries. And I included some women working in television kind of newsrooms and journalists as well, because they're, and television presenters, because their experiences are also really interesting. So quite a broad definition of women working in media industries, and 60 of them in total. This then, when you crack open the book, this is what you're met with. It took me ages to come up with a way of structuring all this information. How would I do it? And then, of course, it ended up being really simple once you finally figured it out. And this is probably the approach that I'll follow today. So maybe we'll begin to talk a little bit about structures in the media industry. You know, what are the kind of patterns that get laid down over time that kind of allow women to do certain things or exclude them from doing other things? When we look at culture, you know, what are the beliefs and values about that are held in this industry around women and around their work? I'm really interested in the idea of subjectivity. So I'm not just interested in how do women experience these external forces of cultures and structures. Subjectivity describes kind of how does work get inside of us? How does it come to shape who we think we are and what we think we can do? And I was really interested to get at that. I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then I was always interested to know, well, you know, how does any of this change? Do women kind of resist or protest, or, you know, how do they deal with the inequalities they face? And then how might we go about changing it? Is it possible to change any of it? So we'll look through each of those themes in turn, and that's kind of what structures the talk today. So beginning then with structures, the television industry in Ireland is very male dominated, obviously, and very kind of clearly split. And you would often see, you know, men will show up in certain roles like directors, and women will be very rare in those roles. But you'll also equally very rarely see a male administrator, and you'll quite often see female administrators. So what was interesting was just how kind of rigid those patterns are. So this little data table is from RTE, which is the Irish national broadcaster, so the public service station in Ireland. They very proudly declare that they have a 50-50 gender balanced workforce of close enough to 2,000 people. But actually, when you drill down into that data, you begin to see, well, maybe it's not quite so balanced. If we look at the television department, which is where these numbers come from, we can see that there's, 322 men and 296 women. Fair enough, that's quite balanced. But a lot of the women predominate in roles that are kind of supportive. So there is what's called horizontal segregation. The women are in kind of the lower ranking roles that are things like program support and administration, and they don't necessarily lead on program making. So the scheduling had 98 women and only 23 men, administration 147 women and only 37 men, but men dominate in those operational roles. So things like camera operator, sound operator, the kind of more hands-on roles, men outnumber women. And in the television news camera department, there's 12 men and not a single woman. So you could see how they're, the overarching data told one story, but when you break down into it, it tells a slightly different story. And so I think it's interesting if we imagine some young woman leaving college tomorrow, ready to start a career in media industries, they're already facing into a pre-existing structure that will kind of push them into certain roles and push them away from other roles. So if a young woman decides, I want to be a director, she's already going to have to break the mold to do that in a way that young men, it's kind of taken for granted that they're going to want to be a director. One person to describe to me, just what it was like to experience that sort of structures that she was starting out, and she could observe every time a new piece of equipment came into the production office, it would be shown to the guys, and there would be an assumption that the younger men were interested in seeing the new camera and that she wasn't interested in it, even though she had explicitly told them that she did want to do it. So she saw how men were kind of nurtured around technical things, and it was sort of presumed that women weren't interested in it. So in that way, there's, again, that at that horizontal level, what roles people get to go into are very clearly kind of boundaried. And in a similar way, the hierarchies. So, if you go left or right when you enter the industry, that's decided by gender. And if you go up or down, that's also affected by gender. We're all familiar with the idea of the glass ceiling, that women can only get so far up in an organization before they hit a block on their progress. But I really like this work on what's a kind of a broader glass architecture by Steiner, where she talks about, you know, glass doors leave women on the outside looking in, can't get into the director role. Glass walls prevent them from moving from, say, an administration job where there's no hope of progression into an operation job where you might get to progress, say, to director. There's the glass cliffs, those leadership jobs that women get when basically nobody else will take them, and women suddenly get made the boss when nobody else wants to be. And all the while, I really like this little picture because, you know, it describes this sort of, there's a glass escalator for men where they're just kind of assumed that they'll automatically progress up the ranks and that that's how things should be. Whereas women have a much rickety and more difficult route into leadership roles, and they have to do it while also carrying lots of burdens about what people think about women in leadership, and also oftentimes carrying a burden of additional childcare as well. We'll talk about that again. Another director kind of put it really nicely and talked about what it meant when there weren't women in leadership roles. As a director, she was constantly pitching for funding and pitching to get a job on often very high-end productions. This particular director, she was doing a lot of work for Channel 4 in the UK, big high-end television dramas. And she could see how, you know, when people were going to invest in a production, they're weighing up risk and they're trying to decide, you know, who's responsible enough, who do I trust enough, who's mature enough, who's going to be able to manage all this money, manage all this talent, who am I willing to invest in? And that oftentimes those investors invest in their own image. And it's kind of that sense of, you know, he looks like me, so I'll give him the budget. And we're very used to men directing films. Of course, men can direct films, whereas the question is always raised, well, can women direct? So she put that kind of really nicely. And another woman who had made it into a leadership role, she was one of 5 women in Ireland who have ever been in kind of very senior leadership roles. And she talked about how, you know, she was often the only woman in the room when decisions were being made, when discussions were being had. So those things all describe this, the way that the film and TV industries are structured through patterns that pre-exist us all, where it just so happens women do administration, men do the more creative stuff, women do the backup roles, they don't do the leadership roles. So we're not going into a level playing field. We're not going into a neutral space. We're going into an industry that is already very heavily gendered, very heavily patterned, where there's an existing and very gendered status quo that women have to operate in. As well as that, then, so that's kind of how structures work. Culture then is equally interesting. And what I think is going on there is that there's kind of a presumption that the whole system of beliefs and values privilege men. So there is, and that goes into kind of, if we begin firstly with the perspective that's applied to content. So if you're going to be, you know, a journalist, say you want to be a sports journalist, there's a presumption already that you'll be working on men's sports. These images that are there on the slide, that's what you get if you Google television sport, not men's sport, just television sport. If you put that into Google, these are the pictures that pop up. And so it's a real issue that the perspectives applied to content are quite normatively masculine. So, you know, there might be women working in the sports room, but they're going to have to report on men's sport in a way that men working in the newsroom might not have to report on women's sport as much. That's beginning to change a little, but quite slowly. And it's a similar in politics. You know, if we Googled television and politics, how many images of men would pop up? Or even if we Googled, you know, television and COVID coverage, how many panels of male doctors would we see? And how many women would we hear commenting on this? So in the culture of media production, there's already a very heavy privileging of men's perspective, men's point of view, men's interest, and women have to go into that. And so the problem, and it's not to say that men's interests should never be covered, of course they should, but they predominate. And there's also an assumption that, well, men are interested in sport, men are interested in economics, men are interested in politics, and women just aren't. So there's a bit of a vicious cycle because we never see women in political programs. we kind of assume they're not interested. If we don't see women in sport, we kind of presume they don't do it, when actually that's not the truth in reality. So there's kind of a pigeonholing that goes on there, that soft emotional issues go to women and the kind of more hard, prestigious stuff goes to the men. There's also the idea that while men can tell women's stories, women can't tell men's stories. So we've all, you know, we've all come across the films where the male director and male writer create these awful female characters that we just don't really identify with. They're more like male fantasies than actual real women. And that's so common that we don't even really comment on it anymore. But the reverse is quite rare. Like Catherine Bigelow's film Hurt Locker is one that always gets mentioned when we talk about women representing men, because it's a very, very masculine story about soldiers in Afghanistan. And she's a female director who told that story, but she's such a rarity. Like that happens so rarely, that there is that kind of notion that, you know, women's stories can be told by men, but not the other way around. Women then also get routinely channeled in and out of particular topics. So this was one of the television presenters I talked to, and she described how, you know, because she was a woman, she was given all these kind of items on fashion, flower arranging, cooking to cover on a daytime talk show. And she found them kind of, as she says herself, mundane, anemic, brain numbing. And she said anything that was in any way serious or intellectual automatically went to her male co-presenter to present. And again, there's no rule written down that, well, women have to cover these things and men have to cover this. It's that cultural piece, you know, it's really invisible, just the sort of invisible logics, the invisible beliefs, the invisible values that exist within TV production that create these situations and then reproduce the culture all of the time. That went also mapped into the women's appearance as well. So one TV presenter talked about, you know, having to look a certain way, having to maintain a certain weight if she wanted to get the more prestigious programs to present. And she talked about being rewarded when she kind of looked the stereotypical part of the very sleek kind of TV presenter. Whereas if she went overweight or didn't have the sleek bob haircut, she felt like she wasn't offered such prestigious work. And she talked about colleagues who even had like weight clauses written into their contracts. And none of the men in that particular station had anything like that going on in their contracts. As well then as women's kind of physical appearance being and their behaviors being regulated, there's also a culture very much in the film industry, but somewhat as well in TV, of kind of work patterns that require people to work really long days, like quite ridiculous hours, sometimes 14-hour days, sometimes 6 days a week. And there's a whole culture there of a very rigid separation of work and life. So straight away, that creates a problem for women workers. In Ireland, women do 76% of care work. So I'm not entirely sure what the situation is in Lithuania, but I have a feeling it might not be very dissimilar, that women take on a lot of the responsibility for care, for managing children. Ireland doesn't have a state creche system like Sweden. Our childcare is very, very expensive in Ireland. And a lot of it falls to women to organize as well as that. So they have that kind of mental load of organizing all of that stuff. And then if you work in film, well, then that's equally problematic because, you know, what happens if a child was sick? There's no flexibility. You could be working very, very long days and a lot of days in the week. It's what's described as bulimic work patterns, loads of work all at once and then nothing for a few months. And women describe basically getting up, going to work, coming home, sleeping, get up, do it all again. And that was very much an accepted culture within the film industry. But it's really problematic for women because, you know, they also then have the care work to do as well. A lot of the respondents talked about, you know, because the whole childcare area and the challenge of that kicking in right from the moment they announced they were pregnant. Women talked about people being given jobs that they had previously been offered. They talked about having looked for a redundancy and been turned down, but then when they announced they're pregnant, suddenly the redundancy is back on the table. They talked about their contracts just ending. They talked about, having to nurse children or express milk while also filming all day, and that there being no kind of support, no HR department in film or TV to deal with any of this, and a whole kind of sense that they could just be discriminated against. And that discrimination was around something like pregnancy, which was just generally received as like a major inconvenience to the production, and not one that the employers felt they had any real responsibility towards, particularly if women worked in small independent companies. That was less the case with, say, the big broadcasters, where they were more amenable to it. But even at that, I know of one very senior series editor in the national broadcaster who was turned down for a promotion because she was pregnant, which is completely discriminatory, breaks Irish law, but they still did it and felt comfortable enough doing it to talk about it as well. So there was lots of instances where even pregnancy became a big issue. There was other forms of discrimination as well in Ireland. There was a very significant pay gap. So the two people you see in this picture, they were our main 6 o'clock in the evening newscasters. So they do the main evening news. One of them is paid 80,000 euros more than the other. So can you guess which of these is the odd one out? Who's getting the extra 80,000 euros, essentially basically for being a man? And that was quite a scandal that broke again while I was writing the book. But there were other instances of it that came up in the book where women had gone for interviews. That one in particular is the news camera department. If we remember back, where there's 12 men and no women, this really accomplished news camera who was working for a different station went for an interview and got turned down, and somebody with a third of the experience she had got the job. So very much like difficult to prove, but I think still quite clearly gendered discrimination. Directors talked about financing, vetoing female directors, because, again, that idea of you're not going to get the story because it's a boy's story and you're a woman, and how could a woman tell a man's story? That's not possible. And those sorts of discriminations going on as well in the culture. Promotions was, that's the one that I actually, this was somebody who was coming through a training course within a broadcaster, and there were 6 of them on the training course, all sort of equally accomplished. But when they finished their training, the men got all the kind of big, juicy headliner programs, and the women got sent off to do quizzes and children's. And that's a real issue within media production, because if, from the minute you finish your training, the men are on a faster track to progress, and the women are sent to kind of go and prove they can do the job. Like, prove you're a good director. We'll give you a children's program to mess about with and show us you can do it, and convince me you can do it. Whereas the men, straight away, they're on that glass escalator of course you can do it, presuming that they can do it. As well as those, so the women experience gendered inequality, they experience bias, they experience discrimination, and then they also experienced flat out kind of sexual harassment. So that came up in lots of different ways. Women talked about, being called high gorgeous by her boss, unwanted kind of shoulder massages, somebody coming up behind her to do that, pictures of all the female presenters being put up in the canteen in the broadcaster, lots of sexist jokes, even a story about a young female presenter who was away on a shoot and the exec producer trying to break into her hotel room at night. So lots of instances of that kind of very wearing sexual harassment. And women talked about, they had experienced that in their early careers, and now they were further on in their careers, and they talked about really regretting not reporting it. But then they also understood, as these kind of quotes show, that it's very difficult for women in media industries in particular to complain. At least if something like this happens in academia, technically, we have a HR department with policies where you go to complain. And if you're on a full-time permanent contract, you have some security in taking that complaint to your employer. Whereas in film and television, because people move contract to contract, Sometimes they're working for, one small independent, then another small independent. They're very, very conscious of reputation, and they're very, very conscious of kind of being seen as good to work with, being seen as, not a problem in any way, being seen as not one for complaining. So there was that notion that you kind of had to put up with this stuff, because if you complained, you would be seen as the one to be the problem. And that brings us back to kind of Laura Madden and just, I suppose, that exceptional bravery and honesty that it took to make those allegations and to make them against somebody as powerful as Weinstein. And that came at the time when Laura was attacked, it literally finished her career. She left film, she left Dublin, she left Ireland, and she never went back to that industry. So that is kind of the price sometimes that women pay when they kind of call out what's really going on. And I suppose it was people like that. I was really interested then. So I felt in the book, in those 2 chapters, I'd mapped pretty well kind of the structural problems women face and the cultural problems they face, the kind of very rigid patterns that are there, and the kind of beliefs and values that underpin that sector. And so next I was really interested to look at, well, what does that do to women? If they experience these blocks on progression, how do they respond? How do they live those kind of narratives, and what do they say about them? And this kind of brought me to the idea of subjectivity. So subjectivity is very much like, how do we each as individuals live those cultural slots that are given to us? So if you are a woman in the film industry, that's an identity that's there. We kind of have a sense of it. But how do people internalize it? How do they live it? How do they see it from the inside out? And I was kind of interested to investigate that. So not everybody reacts to inequalities in the same way. Not everybody is a woman in the same way. Women can choose to kind of inhabit it, perform it, deny it, ignore it, go along with it, lots of different reactions. And in the 60 women that I interviewed, I found lots of different kind of responses to how they dealt with these inequalities. And then I kind of grouped those into different patterns. So there's kind of 3 or 4 different ways really that in patterns that the women tended to react to their experiences. One really interesting response to all of this was outright denial. So women just denied that gender was any issue whatsoever. People talked about, I just work away, I just focus on my work, I don't worry about anything else. I don't think gender was ever a problem for me. That came from one woman who worked in a completely male-dominated news department. She was the only woman in the office, and yet she was still saying, no, I don't think this is any problem. It's never affected the type of jobs I get. Everyone's on the same playing pitch. So it was a really interesting, there was such interesting conversations, because as a researcher, where do you go when somebody says that? When you're trying to research gender with them and they're like, no, there's nothing to see here. You kind of find yourself thinking, okay, this is going to be a long hour to put in. And yet it was kind of fascinating at the same time how they would account for it. Another response that was really interesting, and Rosalind Gill's written a lot about this, Christina Scharf's written on it as well, was this kind of post-feminist neoliberal response to gender inequality. These women could see that gender inequality was a thing, but it was a thing they felt had been overcome in the past. Oh yeah, that was a problem when we were very Catholic and very conservative back in the 70s. Women did have a bit of a hard time. They weren't let do things. Now we can all do whatever we like, and we're over it and we're finished. And so they saw that gender equality was something that was done and dusted, and that they'd be fine so long as they worked hard, proved their worth, that it would all somehow be different for them. They'd be the ones to kind of break the glass ceiling and get on with it. And nothing would stop them becoming directors. There was kind of something wrong with all the other women who had ever tried it before, and that they'd be the ones to do it. And how they adapted to gender inequality then was also by this sort of, adjusting the self. So they were very, very careful kind of how they behaved, where they went, who they associated with. Like they talked about, they wouldn't go drinking with the crew because people might get the wrong idea. And yet the bars and pubs were kind of the places where people networked and agreed on who was working on the next job or heard about the next job coming up. And the women kind of had bowed out of those. and they kind of got different daily rates and stuff. So there was a lot of self-policing went on, and a lot of self-disguising, a lot of adapting the self to the gendered expectations of them. So like one woman talked about, even how you speak, sometimes you have to make yourself not sound too much like a girl. She was kind of just being so post-feminist, turning herself inside out to try to kind of fit. This other quote is really interesting, where a woman said, I felt like an outsider, but that situation was my own doing. It was my own fault. It was my lack of self-belief that was causing me to get left behind. That woman was actually nominated for an Oscar. And yet she's just steeped in this kind of, there must be something wrong with me, that I'm not getting all of the accolades that the men would get if they were Oscar nominated. So like a massive achievement, really huge validation and international validation. And yet what sits underneath it is this sort of willingness to kind of give the world the benefit of the doubt. So there was a lot of that sort of neoliberal adaptation going on. And then there was another one that was really, really interesting, where I kind of hit on this concept, which comes kind of from anthropology, von Genep's idea of liminality, where you're sort of, I think the picture captures it quite nicely. You're sort of in between two things. You're not one swing, you're not the other, you're kind of midair, floating. And the way in which the women were liminal was that they were often insiders because of their expertise. So they were doing the work, they had these jobs, they had these roles, they were part of the industry in that way. But because they were women, they were outsiders. So insiders because of expertise and outsiders because of gender. And somehow they kind of floated in the middle of those two things. So there was lots of different ways in which they saw themselves as kind of liminal and transitional. When they talked of how they told stories, how they directed, credits they got for work, managing finance, they were often well able to do it, but they were frequently kind of questioned and undermined. Like, a director will be questioned by a camera operator. Are you sure you want to do it like that? Or do you really know what you're doing? Can we really spend that budget? Just constant questioning, undermining, chipping away at them in ways that they observed their male colleagues never got questioned. So they would have to deal with that. And so that quote there is from the director who had interviewed for a big Channel 4 piece and just been seen as this kind of, oh yeah, we should have a woman do this, suddenly seeing that it was her gender that they were interested in rather than her directing abilities. So there was kind of different, so the women all experienced somewhat the same structures of exclusion, same cultures of exclusion, but how they reacted to them varied quite a bit. They were in either total denial, they were kind of post-feminist neoliberal about it, or sometimes they were in that sort of liminal space. And then I became interested to think, okay, well, what do they do with that? And I think Mark Banks makes a really interesting point in his books about the politics of cultural production, where he says, cultural production is a really creative industry, so it opens up space for people to think about themselves and to think about how they're doing things and to, in effect, kind of disrupt patterns. So if there's hope for any industry to attain gender equality, it should be creative industries where people are creative about these things, thinking about them, reflecting, open to change, open to possibilities, open to new ways of doing things. So I was quite interested in what way do the women resist this kind of gendered approach to them. And not all of the women by any stretch were willing to do their creative practice differently, but some of them were. And some of them did it by kind of almost pushing against that very strong auteur masculine production in film and television, where, it's all about the director. And the director is held up as a creative genius, even though there's teams of people working to make them the creative genius, often huge teams of women working to that end. And sometimes women just worked outside of those patterns. And women talked about, having a different value on what they were doing. For instance, one of them talked about kind of work intimacy, really enjoying that kind of engagement and collaboration. So the women resisted by not putting the emphasis on me, the individual, but us, the team, and collaborating on their work. and creating that sort of very female space. Another way in which they resisted was kind of prioritizing that ethic of care, what Gilligan calls a feminist ethic of care, where connection again is prioritized amongst group. And a lot of them emphasized kind of collaboration in program making. This was kind of one way in which a producer talked about how she prioritized care in her filmmaking. And oftentimes by emphasizing collaboration in program production, the women resisted that logic of individualism and that male genius director author tradition. And the women were able to kind of resist the status quo in all the ways that you can read there in the quotes that they gave me. And they just basically did the production differently. They worked outside of those norms to emphasize collaboration rather than ego, and to work as teams and to kind of listen to each other and to respond and to have very strong work relationships and kind of what I came to think of as kind of a work intimacy with people around them rather than any big ego issues going on. So there was interesting threads there of how women could resist that very gendered status quo in their everyday practice. But then what was really interesting in Ireland around the time that I was writing the book was there was a much more overt resistance that came about and an overt change that happened. So again, you know, when you're in the middle of writing a book, that's all you want, isn't it? Everything starts to change as you're trying to catch it. It's all literally moving around you, which was great in a lot of ways. So what happened was, Ireland became independent from the British Empire, or began that process in 1916. So in 2015, Ireland was kind of looking down the barrel at its centenary, celebrating the beginnings of its independence. And the Irish government decided there should be a kind of suite of plays put on in the National Theatre that was called Waking the Nation. And so the Abbey Theatre commissioned 10 plays to celebrate our nation's independence, only one of which was written by a woman. And there was uproar. There was huge protests. And outside of the theatre, a whole pile of women gathered under kind of a hashtag. It began actually on social media, which was quite interesting. People protesting and commenting on this decision to run these 10 plays. And the hashtag Waking the Feminists was born. And then there was a meeting at the Abbey Theatre to discuss the plays and what had gone wrong with them. And what had been the Easter Rising became the Estrogen Rising in kind of common parlance around that time. And these are all kind of some of the women that were involved with it and protested the plays. The same thing then translated across to film. Susan Liddy wrote a letter to the Irish Times saying, you know, this exclusion is also going on in the film industry, and what is anybody going to do about it? What was really interesting was within 1 month, the Irish Film Board had issued a gender equality plan. Now, it wasn't that they were sitting there with it ready to go, but they had, in fairness to them, been working on this in the lead up to 2016. But within a month after the Waking the Feminists approach, the Film Board were able to turn around and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to publish the gender statistics. We're going to give funding to women to make films. We're going to do training. We're going to intervene in education. And we're going to work with partners to make sure gender is a consideration across the board. After that, within a year, they set up a kind of a policy target that they would have 50-50 by 2020. I think somebody got carried away with the niceness of the logo or the, you know, how good that sounded. It was really, really ambitious to go from underrepresentation to parity within 3 years. And they didn't ultimately achieve that. But what was interesting was when they didn't achieve it, they created more measures. So they weren't willing to fail. They made more funding available for features, took on new project managers, developed another subcommittee, had a new point of view scheme with tailored support for women working across films. And those measures did start to have a response in film industry. So there was kind of more inclusion than there had been. Similar change happened in the television sector. When the film industry was questioned, the Broadcasting Authority was also questioned, say, well, you're using public money to support film television production. What are you doing and what's the data there? And nobody even had any data in 2016, 2017. It took them until 2018 to kind of cough with the data. that in television production funded by the Broadcasting Authority, there was 43% participation by women, but when it came to writer and director categories, they were under 20%. So again, they issued a strategy statement. So there's a huge kind of range of activity. They issued a gender action plan off the back of that. And then the National Broadcaster in 2018 came up with a diversity and inclusion charter where they'd have a 50-50 gender balance. Now, they were already claiming they had that, but they did also commit to targets around diversity more broadly understood, that they would bring in people from Black and ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTQI members in there. So there were quite a lot of shifts and quite a lot of changes. And of course, during that time, we then also had the Me Too movement. And I think this is Tarana Banks, who had actually started that Me Too movement previous to Weinstein. So Me Too didn't just happen with Weinstein, it actually predates that. And Tarana Banks had used it as kind of a logo for a lot of work she was doing with people who had been victims of sexual assault, sexual harassment. And she, around the time of the Weinstein piece, said, okay, this is really interesting. You have this global kind of social media movement around Me Too. But now that women have disclosed all of this, what are you going to do about it? What comes next? And I think it's a very provocative and really important question. And I think Reese Witherspoon answers it in a really interesting way. When she was accepting an award for the kind of Glamour Woman of the Year, she talks about how in every film script that's sent to her as an actress, there's some damsel in distress who at the moment of crisis turns to the male co-actor and says, co-star, says, oh, what do we do now? And she said, you know, we all know in real life, when a woman's having a crisis, she never turns to some man to say, what do we do now? So I think it really opens up an interesting point that, you know, whatever happens next, it needs to be women who are deciding it and deciding what should happen next. And I suppose like this picture is a self-portrait from around that time and continues to be a self-portrait because of all of the kind of massive gender inequalities we experience in society. And I think my answer to it is, and I think as academics, something that, and as people who work in media industry, I think what we can do is continue the research. So I hope the book, like the one thing I really wanted the book to do was to have women understand that it's not just them. There were so many women that I talked to who said, well, like, this is probably just me, but, and then some big story would come out. And I said, no, it's not just you. I've heard that before. I've heard that from other women. Everybody is saying that. Yes, that's a thing. Yeah, it's a structure. No, it's not just you. And for them to have some kind of solidarity in as much as they were ever able to access or read the book or hear about it. And I'm interested now, having done that piece of work, the next piece of research I want to do is around mothers as a subset of women in the industry, looking at how mothers are framed and treated and what they experience within film and TV industries and creative industries more broadly. I'm also interested in artists and writers and painters, because I suppose the really important thing is, you know, who gets to tell us what it means to be a mother? Who creates the cultural representations around that at the moment? If we think about how excluded women are from cultural production, it's mainly men telling us what it means to be a mother, if they even stop to consider it as part of their representation. And I think we really need to look at, well, what do mothers, what do they experience if they want to work in cultural production? How do they stay going? What do they have to say about that representation? And how can we better privilege and prioritize that? So that's, you know, what do we do next? That's what I'm doing next. And I'm really, really interested to hear both from academics and maybe people working in industry in Lithuania, what you see as familiar from this material, what might be different from it. And also, like, in future work, I'd be really interested to hear from people if they have an interest in talking to me about kind of motherhood as an experience in any kind of form of cultural production. So that's it.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne. It was, yeah. Thank you for amazing lecture. And it was so well structured, you know, alongside the sections of your book. It was very, you know, clear. And you might maybe have noticed that I've been sitting and nodding all the time. Like, I remember just our research that we took with Lina Kaminskaitė on women working in Lithuanian film industry, and there are so I can relate, absolutely. And when you were showing those quotes, I could immediately think of another quote in our research on the same things. So probably now we could open the discussion, and just it would be it would be nice if some of you could switch on your cameras just to feel better, and and you are really welcome to ask any questions. It seems that Anne tried not to be that sophisticated in language, because we have very diverse audience today. So just for those working in film industry or academia, just feel free to answer. Davile is saying that there is no questions on Facebook yet, but I can see that Eva Rajanite,
Hello,
Hi, Eva.
thank you very much for the lecture. And I have one question about the change, which the lecturer mentioned. And this is very often when you start talking about the topic, and some authorities start to say, but the recent years show good changes. And I know from other kind of researchers that things in this particular theme doesn't change that fast. It can take 20 years to change. So I'm interested how the researcher tackles this constant change which is happening, and how to keep the conversation going, even if there's something this year, last couple of years has changed in a good sense, let's say. So that's my question.
It's a really interesting question, and you're right, it's a really challenging kind of area to engage with. In that chapter of the book, what I do is actually go back in time to the 1970s and talk about how women have been campaigning for change in media work and in media representation that far back. So while it looks like there was a very sudden change in 2016, that change is sitting underneath much more activism and an awful lot of engagement that goes back, as you say, 30 years, 40, 50 years before. And I think sometimes we do, have to be both patient and impatient. We have to keep pushing for the changes to happen and to be ambitious and want them, and be kind of active around that and engaged with our research around that. And equally at the same time, I think sometimes we get disillusioned when, like the film board has a policy and they think this is going to change everything in 3 years. And I think what was hopeful about that was, when it didn't change everything in 3 years, they didn't give up. Like they came back with another set of policy measures, and they kind of admitted, look, this is going to be slower than we would like, but it does need to change. So it's a real challenge, that one, isn't it? To how do you stay engaged with the project, pushing for change, but also managing your own expectations around how quickly things can change.
Are there more questions? Yeah, Egle?
Hi, and thanks a lot. That was fascinating. I was struck by the sort of at the beginning of your talk, you presented some numbers from RTE, was it?
Yeah.
So from the national broadcast television, and that the numbers look actually very equal, but when you look closer, it's not all that, the inequalities appear. So I was just wondering a little bit about how the statistics is produced, and what sort of when you are presented with a statistic, how do you go about looking at the inequalities and deciphering the statistic that you are sort of faced with? That's one question. And then another question is around language, gendered language, in terms of when we think about, directors not necessarily wanting to be called women directors or women directors, they, you know, because they are directors. And the sort of the level of complexity that produces, you know, we, in order to achieve equality, we want to erase gendered language sometimes, because it does help to get rid of inequalities in some ways. But when we do that, then it also erases it also makes it harder to see where the inequalities lie. So I just wanted to ask you how you navigate that space. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a question around kind of how you approach research and how you approach data. And I think, yeah, we always have to be a little bit careful about the data. What is it? Who's it coming from? What's it saying? The RT data is really interesting because they actually issued that report in response to the pay gap. So they were caught out by two of their broadcasters working on the same program with an €80,000 pay gap between them. And this raised the question of, well, are all the women in RT discriminated against in this way? Is there a pay gap? What's going on? And so they commissioned a report to look into gender equality in their staff. And of course, the headline finding was RT has a 50-50 gender balanced staff, and we only have an average pay gap like the rest of the country. And there was, but alongside that, there was a whole pile of data that actually, once you started reading through it with a gendered lens and with a gendered eye, you could see the anomalies. You could think, okay, yeah, great guys, but your sports department is 23 men and 2 women. Your camera department has no women. You have women are in all these support roles, but not in any kind of leadership roles. And so you could read the data through kind of a feminist perspective, and you were reading something very different to what RT thought they were giving you. And I think that happens very often. Like, I think Sweden's really, really interesting in a lot of ways as well around its data. Because if you look at a lot of its employment statistics, there is a lot of gender equality. And I think the Swedish Film Board is always feted for the fact that it managed to achieve 50-50 in terms of funding in publicly funded films. Now, commercially funded films still aren't gender equal, but with public money, half it goes to men, half goes to women. But that quantitative data only tells one story, because when you drill down under it, a lot of women working in the Swedish film industry still talk about the same things that my women in Ireland were talking about. So they talk about the bias, they talk about the discrimination, they talk about the camera operators who won't do what you tell them. They talk about being called bitchy if they're very confident about what they're doing. So the qualitative reality can be mismatched with the quantitative data. I think quant data is always really interesting to tell us how much of something's going on and giving us sort of a snapshot picture. But I think we have to be really careful to drill down into it and to see what's going on underneath it. And so in a similar way, there's kind of an answer to the language question, because again, Sweden prides itself on this gender neutral policy, that everything's equal for all genders and gender really doesn't matter anymore. And yet, I think that's why it's also so interesting to talk to people about their real lived everyday experiences of something, because what comes out there is that despite, you know, the best childcare system in the world, and it's public and it's affordable and it's available, and there's, you know, paternity leave is balanced across, there's still real challenges for women who want to work in film or work in cultural production in Sweden around that kind of sexist approaches to it. So I hope that answers some of it. Yeah, some of the women were really resistant to being asked about being women filmmakers. And there was one of them who I asked about being a mother, and she went off like a rocket at me. Said, why are you asking me that? That's got nothing to do with anything. I'm a director. What's the matter if I have children? I said, so what do you want? A world where people pretend they don't have children? And she kind of sat and went, oh, okay, yeah. I said, yeah, maybe men should be asked. Absolutely, male directors should be asked, you know, what's going on with your children? How do you balance this directing life with the fact that you have dependents or care work that you need to do? But I think we need to move away from pretending like the care work isn't happening, because it still needs to happen. And let's face it, who's doing it? Generally, it's a lot of the time it's women.
If I can reflect a bit on the same question, just I remembered when me and Lina were doing interviews with women working in film industry, and we were asking to them to talk about their career path. And the last question was actually, it sounds a bit different in Lithuanian, but still it was, tell us, what does it mean for you to be, a woman director, a woman operator working in the industry? And we've struggled a lot with how to formulate, this question, and still there were some very offensive reactions. And in some cases, we even felt that it's not better not to ask this question, because you've been talking before and you know the position, and you've better, just don't ask it. So yeah, it's always like difficult to navigate through. Yeah, I see that Ruta is waiting to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Good evening, and I would like to thank Anne for a wonderful presentation. And I would like also to continue the question Agla asked, and it's about the phenomenon of denial. And you talked about these even few stages, like a denial or this post-feminist approach, when women are denying the fact of wage gap or denying the fact of discrimination. And when you work with researchers, you know that it exists. There are so many proofs and data that can show it. But when you start to think about what to do next, how to change, how to perhaps seek for more equality, then you can see that women themselves are arguing and are denying the fact of discrimination and are even proud to be non-feminist and so on. So I would like to ask you, how could we approach this phenomenon? And I believe it is a kind of a strategy of survival, or perhaps a way to adapt to a situation. And at the same time, it continues this discrimination. It makes it to go on. So my question would be, how could we approach this denial, or even find a dialogue, but especially with women, because we used to have this male-dominated perspective and to oppose it, but once you have women opposing the goal to attain equality, it becomes quite more complicated. So what would be your advice?
No, I think you have a really strong point, and I think you've hit on it there. Like it is really problematic when it's women doing the denial, because it's almost like it invalidates the research we're doing and the claims we make. But I think it's very much, as you said, Ruta, it's kind of a coping mechanism. I think it would be really interesting to do a study at kind of, if you could do a big longitudinal study of women over their life course, and how their attitude towards gender and gender equality changes across that life course. I think it would be really fascinating. I think a lot of women, when they come into the industry in their 20s, even up until their 30s, start out with that idea about denial and post-feminism. And I'm doing a little bit of work with research with our graduates at the minute, as they enter into media industries, kind of getting a feel for like, what are your expectations? And do you think inequality will be a problem? And they're like, no, it won't be a problem. Or, if I see something happening, I'll report it. And they don't have any, they know it's a very individualistic take on things. And they don't yet have that sense of, no, there's inequalities in my society or in my work or in my organization, and this is my problem. So some of it comes out of a very individualistic perspective on life, where, I haven't had a problem, so therefore there is no problem. And I think what research does that is important sometimes is just document things. Like you then know that that's a thing. And I think it's a research topic in its own right, is, women who deny the existence of gender inequality. I think that makes for a really fascinating study. I think you could look at it in all kinds of fields, in cultural production, in society. Why do women not have a problem with this? I find that very hard to kind of connect with, because I suppose I'm so opposite. I have such a problem with it. But I think, I don't know that you persuade them or change their minds, or, when they're faced with hard data, how do they deal with that? How do they spin that ideologically? But I think the gender denial piece is really interesting. And then I think sometimes that can shift a little bit as women begin to hit some of the problems. So when they get to their 30s and they're not directing and they haven't gotten a feature budget and they're not where they thought they were, and it kind of causes them to sit back and think, is this me or is there something else going on here? And I think sometimes it's an awakening where they begin to kind of shift their ideas around it. But I think what prevents that sometimes is the post-feminist piece. That sort of neoliberal ideology is really, really strong in Ireland. You know, you choose to have children, so you should look after them. It's not our problem. You know, that mentality that it's down to the individual to fix everything and deal with everything. And that's really, really insidious as well. And again, I suppose it's just about documenting it. And those of us who have teaching roles as well and who can engage with graduates and talk to them about these things can really sort of present them with a toolkit for when they do go into industry to maybe have an awareness and a self-reflexivity around it that can be really important. So I don't know if that really answers your question, or other than to say, yeah, I agree, you know, it is a real problem.
Yeah, thank you, Ruta, for your question. Eva, did you have a question?
I have the same question about denial, basically, because in Lithuania I see also it is a bit maybe gender, and then the gender but generation difference. There is, let's say, older woman in the industry denying it, and youngsters very openly talking about it, and yeah. There's different ways how to act on it, and not necessarily right now I don't see as a need to fight this individual woman and change her opinion, and it's good that noting that just saying this opinion or having a look at the person's or someone's not necessarily individual experience from the past perspective. But it's definitely hard to drive the topic, and it's very different than you now talk about the research. Like you, as researchers, you are questioning your interviewers, and that's a bit different when you just try to make some kind of change or talk to some people in positions, and then this comes out, you know, so it's totally different. But yeah, but thanks for insights.
Yeah, if I could add to the same question, from our data from that research with Lina on women working in film industry, it was almost obvious that there is not a huge but still a bit transgenerational gap. Because if thinking about, I really like your ideas, your notion of subjectivity, and I wrote an article on it. And it seems that in Lithuania, probably younger generation identify themselves more with this liminal or neoliberal, let's say. Yeah, they're tending to adjust themselves. And with this older or mature generation just more to deny, and it was quite clear when we've listened to those women.
Yeah.
Did you feel that? Do you feel that there is the same tendency in?
I think if anything in the Irish case it might be flipped slightly, because I think in Ireland it's the older women who are more inclined to understand. Like in the 1970s, women in Ireland had to leave their public jobs once they got married. So there's a thing called the marriage bar. So as soon as you got married, you say, for instance, if you were a primary school teacher, if you went into school Friday as a permanently employed teacher on a full salary, if you got married on Saturday, you frequently came back to work on Monday with no contract on a part-time salary, still doing the same job. If you were allowed back to work, because there was an exclusion on women once they got married staying in the workforce. So you can imagine what the culture was like around journalists. Like a lot of the journalism was done out of the pub. There was a very heavy drinking culture. It was very heavily networked. Women weren't allowed into bars. They were allowed into the lounge part of the pub, but not into the bar area, which is where all the male journalists would have been hanging out, talking to all the main sources on the stories of the day, and drinking quite a lot. So it was a really macho culture that really excluded women. And I think a lot of the older women in Irish media industries remember that, and just remember how hard it was to like walk in there and become part of it. They really do remember pay gaps. They remember blatant sexism of Irish society at that time. And so I think they're a lot less inclined to believe that gender equality is done and we're over it now. So I think some of the most progressive women that I interviewed in Ireland were actually older. And because they had had their careers blocked, you know, as they progressed up the ranks, they only got so far. They never made Director General of television, or they never made the very top editor jobs. Only one or two of them did. And it was a real struggle to get there. So I think they were a bit more inclined to believe in gender inequality. Whereas I think younger women coming in think, oh, you know, that was them. They just didn't know what they were doing. It'll be different for me. And they just think that they'll get on just fine. And then when you have that denial, and when it's very difficult to have that reflective moment where you say, actually, I am being discriminated against here. There is a bias. You know, it's in academia as well in Ireland. You know, we have 50-50 balance at lecturer grade. But when you go to senior lecturer, it falls to like, I think 25%, 75%. And when you go to prof, it falls even further, 17% to 80, whatever percent. And so it's really hard. Like, that means every woman you work with has a much lesser chance of making professor than any of the men you work with. You know, what do we do with that? You know, how do you, denial becomes kind of attractive, and ignoring it to some extent becomes attractive until you just can't really deny it anymore and you feel you need to do something with it. And I do think, you know, doing research on it can be a comfortable enough space. And I think doing activism on it is really hard going, because you are then trying to canvass and convince people and rally them around and get them to work together on change. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
But there is the upside story that, you know, then change can come really suddenly and almost out of nowhere. You know, that there was quite a radical rehaul of the Irish film and television industries, really off the back of quite a spontaneous social media protest. You know, so, and it did bring about quite radical changes.
Yeah. Do we still have questions? If not, probably we could finish. Yeah. I'm just looking if there are questions. There are no questions on Facebook. Yeah. So thank you, Anne, for inspiring lecture. And also I'd like to thank to organizers for those who contributed and make this lecture happen, and to the audience who took part today and joined us. And I hope to see you in other events that are planned by Madden Network. Mm-hmm. So thank you all, and see you.